Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Marc Button. I'm the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at UNL. I want to welcome you to the Thomas C. Sorensen Seminar Series featuring Ambassador Marc Grossman. This lecture is brought to you in cooperation with the Clayton Yeutter Institute of International Trade and Finance at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Tom Sorensen was a Nebraska native and graduated from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in 1947 with degrees in political science and journalism. Thomas started his career as a journalist here in Nebraska and then began work with the U.S. State Department. He ultimately became Deputy Director of the United States Information Agency at the height of the Cold War, was stationed at U.S. embassies in the Middle East, and went on to have a long and distinguished career in public diplomacy. In 1996, Tom Sorensen generously provided the College of Arts and Sciences with an endowment to promote discussion of critical public policy topics. Through this endowment, the University of Nebraska Public Policy Center has brought policymakers and experts to UNL in Nebraska through the Sorensen Policy Seminar Series for over 2 decades now. It is highly fitting then that today's guest speaker brings a very distinguished legacy and career in public service in international diplomacy. Ambassador Marc Grossman served in the U.S. State Department for 29 years, including as the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, the State Department's 3rd highest ranking official. He was U.S. Ambassador to Turkey from 1994 to 1997 and helped marshal diplomatic support for the international response to the September 11th attacks, and was the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan from 2011 to 2012. We are extremely fortunate to have Ambassador Grossman join us today to discuss the future of U.S. diplomacy and the Foreign Service at a critical time for our nation and our world. On behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences and all of our partners, I would like to thank you again for joining us today and welcome Ambassador Grossman for what I'm confident will be an engaging presentation and discussion. I'll now like to turn it over to Jill O'Donnell, who will be moderating this discussion. Jill is the director of the Yeutter Institute and a professor of practice here at UNL. The Yeutter Institute is an interdisciplinary institute focused on research, education, and public engagement on international trade and finance, and is named for Nebraska native UNL alumnus and renowned trade expert Clayton Yeutter. Jill's prior experience in international relations and U.S. foreign policy spans Capitol Hill, international organizations, research entities in the private sector. She's worked with Ambassador Grossman on projects related to the future of diplomacy, so I think we're in excellent hands today for what I think will be a wonderful conversation. Jill.
Thank you, Dean Button, for that introduction, and thank you to the College of Arts and Sciences for its partnership, as well as to the University of Nebraska Public Policy Center for its partnership on this conversation today, especially Mario Scalora and Tarek Abdelmonem. Ambassador Grossman, I'm so pleased to welcome you virtually to Nebraska and to Lincoln. I've wanted to do that for a long time, so thank you for joining us today for a really timely conversation. I'd like to just briefly remind the audience that you can use the Q&A function to submit questions that you have at any point during this webinar. We will try to integrate them into the conversation as we can, and we'll also save a little time at the end for audience questions as well. Ambassador Grossman, let's just dive right in. You are right now working with former colleagues of yours who are also former ambassadors, retired career foreign service officers, on a project called the American Diplomacy Project, a foreign service for the 21st century. So you've been thinking about this for a long time. Why don't we start by having you give us an introduction to this project, how it got started, and how you got involved with it, and what the aims are.
Sure, Jill, thank you very much. I hope you just allow me 1 second to say some thank yous. First of all, to you, Jill, it's nice to see you again, and I hope the next time we'll be in person. Secondly, to all of the people who were involved in organizing this wonderful affair, Dean Button, thank you very much for the introduction. And I must say, not just the Yeutter Institute, but the idea that this is an endowed program from someone who served the country as a public diplomacy officer, was at the State Department. So I'm very proud to be part of this Sorensen effort. So thank you very much to him and to his family. Jill, this really started about 3 years ago. Ambassador Nick Burns and I were talking about what it was that we could do to give back to the profession that gave us so much. And we started to think a lot about the future of the Foreign Service. So much has changed. Our foreign policy has changed. The world has changed. The people who become diplomats have changed. And very importantly, as your very important project, University of Nebraska and the Carnegie Institute showed, people are thinking differently about foreign policy, and they want different things from their diplomats. We thought about how to manage this for some months and decided finally that we could proceed. It got to be January 1st, 2020. And of course, we had a great plan for all the things we were going to do, and then COVID came. So we, like everybody else, adapted and adopted. And so we've been working a lot on Zoom. We've been meeting different people. But the basic fundamental question here is, and when you say, why do I want to get involved, is I had a career in the Foreign Service, and I'm proud of it. And it was great. And I thought I played a modest part in serving the United States of America. But what we want to do now is see if it's possible to bring about some change in this system for the people who are serving and the people we hope will serve in the future. So as I say, it's a matter for trying to give back a little bit to the career that we had. One of the things that's worked out for us, and I don't mean to in any way diminish, the terrible things that have happened during COVID, but this Zoom opportunity has given us the chance to meet with people we might not have done. So we've had 18 workshops of all different kinds of people in the Foreign Service, people out of the Foreign Service, people who left happily, people who left madly, unhappily. We spoke to senior military officers, senior business people. And we've also been able, because we didn't want this just to be an inside the Beltway problem, is we've, through groups like yours and through the World Affairs Councils of America, have been doing a number of public events as well. And the other day I counted up, and we've spoken to about 900 people altogether. And I'm not saying, in a university setting, that's, it's not exactly political science. I don't know that they would meet some great standard, but we've talked to 900 people, all of whom were interesting. And every single one of us encouraged us to keep going and to keep seeing if we couldn't provide some support, as I say, to the people who are serving today and the people we hope will serve the United States of America as diplomats for a very long time to come.
Okay, so I want to get into what you're hearing or what you have been hearing through these listening sessions with 900 people across the country. But first, I want to get in a little bit more to the premise of the project and kind of the problem at the heart of all this. So the premise, as I understand it, of the project is that you've stated the Foreign Service is losing its capacity to serve the American people effectively, and your goal is to rebuild the Foreign Service and reconnect with the American public through this project. Mm-hmm. So in your view, what has contributed to this loss of capacity that you've identified? And also, I know you've been thinking about things like this for many years. I know that firsthand. So it's not new to say the Foreign Service may need an update, but what do you think is bringing some more urgency to this right now?
Yeah, thank you for both questions. Well, first, I think the easiest answer to your first question, and one of the reasons that sentence is in our effort about reconnecting to the American people, is the work that you did with Carnegie. What was the name of this project, right? You were looking at middle-class perspectives on foreign policy. And my view of all this is a pretty simple one, which is to say that I think there's been a very great divide between kind of people who think about foreign policy, talk about foreign policy, and they're no longer making a big connection to the people who pay for that foreign policy, and without whom there can be no support for foreign policy. So look at your finding. People said, hey, pay attention to my job. Pay attention to exports. Pay attention to what it is that I need to make my family successful. And that's what I think has been lost over these past few years. I've thought for a long time, especially in these past, maybe certainly since COVID anyway, that there's starting to be a disconnect between the way citizens, you and I, think about the national interest and the way people who are sort of leaders in these fields think about the national interest. We now have citizen interests that talk about keep me healthy, make sure I have a job, will my children be better off than I am? And I think sometimes people who do this foreign policy work forget that those are the important questions for citizens. And so the first thing we thought of was your work, the work you did with Carnegie, to say, how do we bridge that gap? How is it possible to realign those efforts? And so you say the second question, so why now? Yes, people have been thinking about this for a long time. I think the honest answer is things have gotten worse. I think the Foreign Service culture internally has gotten more challenging. In every single one of the workshops that we did, and in many of the public events, people pointed out that there was a lack of diversity in the Foreign Service, a lack of diversity and inclusion, and that we just took the opportunity, since we both were out, to be free to say some things maybe that people who are still inside did not. The other thing was that the third thing is that we felt this was very important to be bipartisan and not be a campaign question. And so we have set up our goal is to issue this report after the election. So we hope to come out, in the middle of November with some ideas. And that's because we didn't want it to become a campaign question. A lot of the things that are involved here are going to have to be legislated. They're going to have to be put into executive orders and regulation. And so we can't say, well, it's this president or that president. But we want to start a bipartisan conversation across the aisles nationally to what needs to be done to give more capacity to this tool we have called diplomacy.
Okay. So one more question to follow up on this before we move on to what you've actually heard in the listening sessions, and that is, do you think that this disconnect has always been there to some degree? Can you look back at a time when there was more connection between what our diplomats were doing and what your average citizen was thinking about or worrying about every day, or not? I mean, it's clear we've talked a lot about how the problems of foreign policy are much more global, transnational, they cross borders, they involve specialized subject matter now on economic questions, environmental questions, digital technology. So that all still holds, that's all still there, still part of this conversation that's been around for a while. But in terms of this citizen, diplomat connection, can you think of a time when that was better? Or has there always been some disconnect there?
Well, I think there's always been some disconnect. If you think about, the way the Foreign Service started, right? It was started with a small group of, white guys who went to Yale and to Princeton. I went to UC Santa Barbara myself, so I recognize this. So there's always been a distinction, I think, and one of the reasons that we are so focused on changing the State Department culture. In other words, the problems of the Foreign Service, the problems of American diplomacy, are not all from the outside. This didn't all happen to us. And what we've been trying to say is that you have to change the culture of the Foreign Service so that people use as judgment and as a judgment about each other how much they are trying to connect to people outside of the State Department and to foreign governments. I'll say, if you'd allow me, Jill, to jump ahead, it's one of the reasons that we have recommended that we change the name of the Foreign Service. Because here I spent my career proudly as a U.S. Foreign Service officer, and how many times did I meet Americans in Kansas City or in California or in other places who thought, I was in the Forest Service or in the Foreign Legion, and we thought that this idea that foreign should be the first word in this just seemed crazy to us, and that people should know they have a diplomatic service of the United States of America, just like they have military services, the Navy and the Army and the Air Force, Marines. And we wanted diplomat and service and United States of America to come first and not foreign. Now you could say, well, that's not such a big deal. But I think branding's important. And we also wanted to send a message back into the system that something has changed and that they have new priorities. So the answer to your question is, it's never been great, but we want it to be better.
Okay. So moving on then to the listening sessions that you and your colleagues have held as part of this project. I know it's been across the country. You mentioned 900 people at least, that you've spoken with, current and former State Department officials, military officers, intelligence services, business leaders, concerned citizens. So I want to know first, what kinds of questions have you been asking, and what are you hearing from those who actually have had experience in government service or the State Department versus those who have not? Are there differences in what you're hearing from the different types of people you're talking with?
Well, the questions we've been asking are, so what do you want? How can we fix this? And one of the reasons that we focused in on our military and intelligence colleagues was because they have been through what our military friends call a brutal reassessment of their own services, especially if you think about after Vietnam or after the failed hostage rescue mission. Brutal was the word that they used. And they said, until you have this honest look at yourselves, you can't really reform. And the intelligence people said the same thing after the weapons of mass destruction question in Iraq in 2003. And so they had a lot of support from the Congress, support from the administration, but they were looking into their own culture and their own ways and prejudices and actions. And so that's the first thing we heard consistently. Second thing we heard consistently was be bold. Take on some things that really need changing. Of course, because most of the people who had served in government were also former government officials, they said, be bold, but of course be practical. And yes, so we've tried to balance those things. And then we heard kind of several really specific things, at least from that group of people. And I'll come back to the citizens in a moment. First, there was a lot of desire, both for people inside the State Department and in other government agencies, that there be a better definition of what's the State Department actually supposed to do? Like, what's its mission? What's its mandate? Everybody, I think, understands what a military is supposed to do, or the Foreign Agricultural Service, but what is it that the State Department is supposed to do? And what makes the State Department unique? In other words, what is it that you bring to the policy formulation and policy execution set of questions? Secondly, and very controversial, we asked people whether they thought that a new Foreign Service Act was required. And as you know, Jill, in this century or last century, we had 1924, 1947, 1980 in the last century. Those are the three great Foreign Service Acts. And we felt that 40 years on, perhaps things had changed enough to do this differently. Now, there's a lot of controversy about that because the 1980 Act has some very important things that are worth saving. But we all thought, given the changes in the world, the changes in the people who are diplomats today, that we wanted a new act maybe to revitalize people's interest in the State Department. Third, we heard a lot about politicization. That's a terrible word, but it's too many political appointees at the State Department. Too many political appointee ambassadors, too many political appointees at the State Department. That's our view. I recognize there are other ways to think about this, but we wanted to try to not make that number zero. I'm not against all political appointees. We're trying to lower that number substantially. Diversity, as I said, in every single workshop, people brought up the question of diversity, racial diversity, ethnic diversity, diversity of thought, diversity of geography, diversity of talent. And not just diversity, but as you all know in your lives, it's also a matter of inclusion. It's one thing to be invited in, the next thing is, can you participate? And so diversity, inclusion, big theme all throughout our conversations. Professionalism was the next theme. If you think about those members of your audience, and in particular from your work, that our military colleagues, they really focus on professionalization. People are getting master's degrees and PhDs at universities all around the country, like the University of Nebraska, hundreds of people. And the State Department has none of that. And that's, again, a cultural question. We have not valued it. It's also a resources question. We don't have enough people to send people out for long-term training. I worked for Secretary Powell, and he and I used to do this thing in public, and he'd say, so Mark, he'd say, you're a relatively senior Foreign Service officer. How much professional education have you had in your career? I'd say, oh, Mr. Secretary, like 2 weeks, other than language training. And he'd say, well, I had 6 years of professional education in my career. So professionalization, making people more professional, really important. And then there's the personnel system, which then has to support that question of professionalization. We are calling for a limited a mid-level entry program so that people can come in and out of the department to try to understand how people are working today, especially young people. And a big thought is to try to create a diplomatic reserve corps. This we heard a lot, so that we were broadening out the capacity to surge in an emergency, but also have people come and go and be available to the department, like that our military colleagues have. And finally, as I said, we heard a lot about, let's change the name and get the foreign out of this, and help remind American citizens that this is the diplomatic service of the United States.
Okay, so there's lots to follow up on there, which I'd like to get to. First, I want to ask one more question on this front about what you heard, and that is, given that you and your colleagues listen to people all across the U.S., did you find any regional differences in what you were hearing, particularly from private citizens that you heard from all around the country?
We did not. I know that's of great interest and was very interestingly highlighted in your report, but we did not detect that great difference. I'll tell you what one of the big themes was we heard from lots of young people, how do I join the Foreign Service? Is it still good to join the Foreign Service? And we were delighted, believe me, to answer those questions. And so, especially at the World Affairs Councils, where like universities, they encourage students to come, we heard a lot about, how do I get in? And so that was very heartening. And that was a thing, Jill, we heard all across the country.
Well, I know we have some listeners today who want to hear from you on that very question, which we will get to. So we'll come back to that one. So when it comes to reconnecting, rebuilding trust between citizens and the Foreign Service and diplomats, I want to kind of get into that set of questions next before following up on some other areas. And this is where I want to quote a piece you wrote for Yale Global Online a couple years ago, where I think you said it very well. And quoting from that, you said, quote, "As a diplomat, I learned that how one describes things matters. The words liberal, rules-based international order mean nothing to 99% of the American public," unquote. So as you've mentioned, our report here, where the University of Nebraska partnered with the Carnegie Endowment to listen to Nebraskans about their views on foreign policy in the summer of 2019. And I can say that many people that we talk to here in Nebraska would mention things like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or the World Trade Organization, or the importance of allies, or the importance of export markets for agricultural goods. So those are all parts of this liberal international order, but no one uses that phrase. And so I want to talk to you about, how do you think that we can talk about foreign policy and the work of diplomats better with everyone?
Well, I don't mean to be naive or in front of a distinguished audience like this be too simplistic. But one of the reasons I wrote that article was that the words liberal rules-based international order does not contain anywhere American interests, United States interests, what's good for Americans, how Americans benefit from this. And so, my argument was, you can go on and on and on and talk about the liberal rules-based international order, and I'm not against it, I'm for it. But the only way to talk about it to people is to say that inside of this concept is benefit to you, right? So that the United States of America is better off when there are more pluralistic societies in our world. The United States is better off when we set the rules. We don't want the Chinese to set the rules on trade. We don't want the Russians to set the rules in Europe. We want to do that because that's good for the United States of America. And so I think, Jill, the work that you all did with Carnegie it put data to a thought that we all had, but you all went and proved it, right? Which is to say that people do understand their stake in the international community. And that's especially true of people who have, sons and daughters serving in our military, people who are serving abroad for big American companies, people who have children in the Foreign Service. So people do understand this, but I think it doesn't work if you talk to them about sort of PhD level concepts in international relations. People want to know, how does this support the United States of America? And by extension, how does it support me?
Exactly. So that is a good summary of what we heard. And I want to share, one more quote that we heard that I think this is one particular quote from something we heard from a Nebraskan who participated in this project, but it really reflected what a lot of people said to us in different ways. And that was really reflecting a lack of trust between citizens and Washington writ large, or foreign policy professionals. And this person said, quote, "I don't think anybody knows what the truth is, and I don't trust Washington to tell me what the truth is," unquote. So that was a very common sentiment throughout our discussions. And so I want to ask how you would respond to that, and how you would respond to the question, what can be done to rebuild that trust? You're doing that through the project that you're working on, through the listening sessions, et cetera. But that was a pretty striking comment that we heard. And so I wanted to ask how you'd respond to that.
Well, I'd respond in a couple of ways. One is, I think it's important to tell the truth. One of the reasons I think people don't feel that people are telling them the truth, and I don't mean that of this administration or the last one, but sort of generally, is sometimes you find out that you didn't get the whole truth. And my view of all of this has been you need to level with people, and you need to respect people's understanding and their intellect, and they can understand this. People understand. They understand what's going on in the world, I think, to a much, 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 much greater degree than people who live their lives as U.S. Foreign Service officers, or hopefully someday U.S. diplomatic service officers, give them credit for. And that's another cultural problem. So, Jill, one of the answers here is that U.S. people who serve in the U.S. diplomacy can't stay in Washington or overseas anymore. They have to get out and do these kinds of events. And I know, you all have worked closely with the American Academy of Diplomacy. And those are very important efforts to have people come out. And, I don't know what's going to happen a year from now when, knock on wood, there's a vaccine. But for goodness sakes, we've sure learned through Zoom and other platforms a great way to do this. right? You don't have to worry about when I can travel, all here and all there. We could do it like this. It's not perfect, I got it, but it's certainly better than nothing. And so I hope that there'll be a hybrid model here, and that more and more and more people will speak to the American people, number one, and number two, have a chance to listen to people, right? So that's the other thing, is that is the listening part of this is enormously important. We in these sessions have not been trying to kind of broadcast our findings. We haven't even, they're still in draft. We started writing this week. So we've gone to every single one of these sessions saying, someone's got a good idea, let's hear it. So I think a State Department culture change needs to take place where people trust our citizens and where people are more active in this conversation.
So that brings me to another question I have for you on this note, is that once diplomats are doing that, what is it that they can do with that information? How can they integrate that into their work? And I ask this because another important finding from not just our Nebraska project with Carnegie, but the project that Carnegie did in Ohio, was that there are definitely disparate impacts of certain foreign policies in different parts of the country. So trade policy is a very good example of that, where in Nebraska, we heard lots of support for agricultural export markets. That's important here. The message on trade in Ohio was very different. There's a different perception of how trade policy has impacted manufacturing and others there. So given the disparate impact of different foreign policies on different parts of the country, once diplomats are more connected to citizens, how should they integrate that information into their work when their job is to pursue the national interest?
I think that's a great question. I think the first thing that I would say, and again, I don't mean to be simplistic or naive, but I think if diplomats had a chance to be out more and listening to people, and as you say, kind of retying this trust together, that they would, I think, first of all, get more fired up about doing the economic work that is so important, about promoting American export products, about promoting American investment abroad. And very importantly as well, I can tell you from my own experience, by promoting the way America does business. So the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the way we treat workers, the way people, the way we consider questions of the environment, right? These are all really important things that set a standard for how business ought to be done. And I think that more people were out in communities and had people say to them, like was in your report, hey, what matters here is my job, oh, by the way, and my industry. Then I think the question of whether it's what Ohioans think or whether Nebraskans think, that's something that you can balance. But at root, we're still at a point, I think, where people at the State Department need to get kind of more active and more aggressive and more connected to the fundamental question of promoting America's economic interests. And I'm not saying that people don't do this. They do. Really, they do. And the State Department's been great the last few years. There are now awards for people who do this. But we don't communicate it so well, I think, back to the public. And that's something that needs to be done more effectively.
So I'm going to bring in here a related audience question that was actually submitted a little bit earlier. And again, this has to do with diplomats doing the job of listening and engaging with citizens. And this question that came in from an audience member was this: how does increasing partisan polarization affect American diplomacy? Is it harder for diplomats to make commitments, or does it actually create more flexibility over time? So how would you integrate that into this discussion here?
Well, I think the partisanship really makes it much harder. And again, that's not a question of this administration or the last one or the one before it. It's certainly something that's been growing over the past many years. It seems very old-fashioned to say now, but when I joined the diplomatic service, there was this rule that partisanship stopped at the water's edge. And I don't see that anymore from either party. And I think that's too bad. And so in answer to the question from your listener, I think it makes it harder because people don't know in other governments, well, is this policy going to last 4 years or 8 years or 12 years? You talked earlier about Nebraskans mentioning NATO, right? So here's the most, I think, this is my view, the most successful military alliance in history, right? And so it's now older. And that's because people felt that the United States was going to remain committed to this throughout. I think about some of the good policies that I had a chance to work on. You think about our policy toward Colombia, Plan Colombia, went from Republican administration to Democratic administration to Republican to Democrat, and it followed through. I think a lot of things changed there. You think also of our policy toward India. That started with a Democratic administration, was very greatly moved forward by a Republican administration, then continued by another Democratic administration, Republican administration. So I think the more of those kinds of policies we can find and we can stick with, the better off we're going to be.
Okay. So one more kind of question, bringing in the Nebraska Carnegie Report again to this discussion. You've mentioned a couple of times what people care about are their jobs, their economic livelihood, the kinds of things that they have to think about every day. And so the premise of the Carnegie Project in Nebraska and the other two states, Ohio and Colorado, was how can U.S. foreign policy better serve the economic interests of the American middle class, was the kind of the question at the heart of the whole project. And so what I wanted to ask you is really how can U.S. foreign policy as carried out by diplomats promote the economic well-being of the American middle class when many economists and others will tell you that the distributional impacts of things like trade policy are really something that has to be handled by domestic policy. So we get a blurring of domestic and foreign policy, or perhaps the necessary pairing that we need. So how can the actual work of diplomats, though, really have an impact on the economic well-being of middle-class Americans everywhere?
Well, let me try to answer that question in three ways. First of all, I think it is, as your report did and others do, to, as you say, focus in on jobs. But my own observation is that people also in the United States, citizens, are also interested in American values, right, and what it is that we project. So yes, it's right to talk about jobs, but I think people in the United States also want to be proud of their country, proud of what their country represents, and that's an important piece of this as well. So I think I'm glad to talk about jobs, but there are larger questions out there about what the United States stands for that I think American citizens support and understand and will continue for some time to come. On the question of sort of how it is that diplomats can do this, and you're right to say, okay, so a lot of this is domestic economic policy. I heard someone speak a couple of years ago and talked about what we're now dealing with is intermestic, right? So both international and domestic. And I think that's true. And I think Ambassador Yeutter would have said that to be true were he here, right? That this is now some combination. So it's not possible, seems to me, to have a foreign service of the 21st century without bringing in now people who are economically not just literate, but really expert. In the same way, you're going to need data analytics, and people who know about AI, and people who know about the environment, people, all kinds of different things. Someone I know is interested in food security on this call. And so those are the kinds of questions that need to come now to the State Department so that, third, people can represent out to the world what a great job American manufacturers, American service providers, American agricultural interests do around the world. And so, when I had the good fortune to represent the United States abroad and at home then abroad, what was I doing? I was always looking for ways to support American products and support American businesses. Why? Because it's good for people back home, but it's also good for us abroad. So I think about in Turkey, where we had the opportunity to build from the ground up an enormous plant that helped an American aircraft manufacturer. But it didn't just produce airplanes. It produced, as I said before, a way of thinking about employer-employee relations. It gave a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful other view for Turks of what the United States is about. And so this works both ways. And so I'm a big supporter of doing more on the sales and the exports and the investment side, because it's good back home, but it's also an enormously wonderful and positive part of our foreign policy if you're creative enough to use it that way.
Okay. I want to shift now into talking a little bit more about the recommendations that the project you're working on is developing. And one of those has to do with creating new pathways into a foreign service career, which you mentioned a little bit at the outset, but three of those are: one, creating a diplomatic ROTC at the college level to get underrepresented college students into this career pipeline earlier on. You mentioned the Diplomatic Reserve Corps, and you mentioned a kind of a mid-level career, sort of lateral entry sort of path into the foreign service, where you could tap people with certain types of expertise to come in for limited appointments. I think those are all really interesting, and we're seeing, others put forward similar ideas as your group is doing. So do you think that, given that I think that there is more discussion around creating these new pathways, which would be a big change to the Foreign Service and how the Foreign Service hires its diplomats, do you think that there's a groundswell of support developing around doing this? Or do you anticipate pushback to keep it how it is? And also, if these pathways were to be created, do you think that that would be another avenue for building trust between diplomats and Americans, because you'd have more people coming in at more varied points in their career from more places? So.
Yeah, exactly right. Let me start with the last question. Yes, absolutely. One of the things that we've thought hard about here is reciprocity in order to create these bonds again. So if you had a reserve corps, you had a limited mid-level entry, you'd have people going back and forth. And you'd hope that someone came from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and helped the State Department for a while with food security, to go back to that example. And then she or he might go back to the university and say, you know, those State Department people, they're not so bad. And diplomats do a good job. And I learned a lot in my time at the State Department. And perhaps she might come back again. So for your last question, absolutely. It's one of the main reasons that we're attracted to these programs. But let me take each one in turn, Jill. First, one of the things that we heard a lot in our conversations with our military colleagues, and particularly also people who are interested in the diversity and inclusion questions, was the State Department waits too late to start recruiting. And that you need to start earlier. And people need to know in high schools about the path to becoming a diplomat. You can't become a diplomat in high school, but you know, people in high school start thinking about military careers, but nobody in high school thinks about a State Department career. And so the ROTC program focused on high schools, and particularly high schools, you know, where there are more minority populations, underrepresented populations. We think that'd be a really good experiment to try. And as you know, we have a couple of programs like that. One, the Pickering Fellows, the Wrangell Fellows, very successful. And this administration is increasing them, which I think is great. But we'd like to find a way to get to high school students, at least make the pitch. In terms of the Reserve Corps, exactly as you say, the State Department is often faced with surges. If it's conflict, maybe there's a hurricane, maybe there's another kind of natural disaster. And we find ourselves always behind. There's just not the capacity to serve. And I don't think you ought to have it 100% of the people hanging around waiting for something to happen, right? What has our military showed us? That the Guard and the Reserve is a really successful way to provide that kind of to provide that kind of expertise. And it would also be a way for people to come and go. And it would be a serious thing. Like the military, there'd be a couple of weeks of training. People may have to be worldwide available. I don't want this to be a joke. I want it to be rigorous and serious and non-political. Similarly with the mid-level entry program. So this, as you say, this is going to be controversial. So when you say, do I expect pushback? Oh yes, absolutely. But we became convinced over these 7 months that it was really time to try this. And to try it in a limited way, in a non-political way, and to experiment with it. Because as you say, you know, young people who are listening today, they have a different view of work and how many jobs they're going to have in their careers. They have a different view of what the responsibility of the employer is to them. You know, it's an alliance rather than a career. And that's fine. And I think the State Department has to start to live with these realities. I'll end with this. I hope, this is me speaking, I hope that the vast majority of people who become diplomats will do what I did and stay for a full career. And you can say, oh, that's a dinosaur's view. Maybe so. But this is a career like our military colleagues in which hierarchy and discipline and experience matter. And those three things still have benefit to the conduct of American diplomacy. The other thing I say to young people is, you know, you want to move every 3 years? Well, we're your career, right? I can keep moving every 3 years if you'd like for 30 years. And so if that's the goal, and if that's the ethos of people who want to work in that way today, I think the Foreign Service, the diplomatic service is actually the perfect place for people to do this. But I say, I want the majority to be careers because of discipline, because of hierarchy, because of expertise. But we are going to propose these three other paths because we need them and the world around us is changing.
So two follow-ups then on this note, Mark, Ambassador Grossman, and that is, one is, as you mentioned, food safety and food security. We had a professor here submit a question about how there are topics such as food safety that academics can be very helpful on. They have the expertise, and he wondered how they can get involved without being a government employee. And so we've mentioned these pathways that might be created. They don't exist yet. So my question to you is, how could someone like him offer that expertise in foreign policy and diplomacy until such time as maybe we have these other pathways? So I'll start with that one, and then I'll have one more follow-up on this.
Sure. I don't mean to get too much in the weeds, but since you ask, I think, and I'm no big expert in this, and it's been a while since I was an active duty officer, but there is, as I recall, something called Schedule B, and it allows the State Department to bring experts in these kinds of fields. Also, the State Department has had now a wonderful program for about 20 or 25 years where scientists have come and they're kind of scientific fellows, and they come for a couple of years, work in the various bureaus like the Bureau of Oceans, Environment, and Science, or other places in which they have expertise, and they don't lose their faculty position or position in their research institution, but they come, they compete, and then they come for this period as science advisors. So the Schedule B, the science opening, I think there are a number of ways this could be done now. Our goal is to try to make it easier in the future.
Okay. And secondly, we also had a number of students and others actually submit questions to us beforehand about what your advice is to students or others who might be considering pursuing a career in the Foreign Service. So I'll go ahead and ask you that one right now.
Well, my advice is please, yes. I hope that people will consider it. I hope people will take the test. I hope they'll take it in large numbers. I hope people will pass the test and then get through the other wickets and join the Foreign Service, or I hope someday the Diplomatic Service. And that is, I believe in playing for the long haul here. The United States of America is a great country and is going to be a great country for many, many, many years to come. And we're going to need the best people possible to represent us. And so I say to any student or anyone else who's interested in joining the Foreign Service, please, please do so. It was a great career for me. It's been a great career for many, many, many people. I think the idea of being able to serve the United States of America, to live abroad, to be curious about how other people live their lives, to live, to have a chance to participate in some pretty significant events, all those are great. As Dean Button said, I'm retired, and as you said as well, you can imagine I have a lot of people come see me who are still in the service, and oh, they want to leave, and oh, this and oh, that. I say, listen, there's no substitute for working in an office where the American flag flies, and you ought to hold on to that privilege as long as you have it. And then there are lots of wonderful other opportunities in this world. There are. But if you can get this for a while, take it and then hold on to it. So I found having the opportunity and the privilege to represent the United States of America was a great honor for me, and I hope other people will do it. Sure, there's some disadvantages to life abroad and life for your family, and it's hard sometimes. It's much more dangerous now than it was. But what a great life, and what a way to lead what former Deputy Secretary of State Rich Armitage would call a life of significance.
Thank you for that. I want to turn now to the need for a new Foreign Service Act, which you mentioned earlier. And at the beginning, you outlined several steps that you, through the American Diplomacy Project, and your colleagues will be recommending. And this would require, as you said, legislation or executive orders. And so I want, if you would walk through just a few of the elements of a new Foreign Service Act you think would be most important, and what you think it might take to build consensus in Congress for doing this.
Well, let me start with the second question. It'll take an enormous effort to build consensus in Congress. That's what our predecessors learned in 1980, that they had a President Carter, who was interested in this. They had a Secretary of State who was interested in this, and that there were people on Capitol Hill who were very interested. But I think this can be done. I mean, if you think about the Goldwater-Nichols Act, which transformed the American military, those are two names from the Senate, and they were interested in this. And there are a number of people who are interested in diplomacy, and we've been working very hard these past few weeks to brief people about the project, listen to them, get their ideas, Republicans and Democrats in the House and the Senate. But it'll be a huge effort, And I don't know whether I don't know whether people will be prepared to undertake it. I hope they will. But what we thought the honest thing to do was to recommend it. And so it'll be a huge effort, and it'll be very controversial. So, okay, I don't think you can accomplish these things without taking on the hard questions. In our view, Jill, many of the things that you and I just went through can only be done through legislation. There's no way a diplomatic reserve corps can be created without legislation. I don't think a mid-level entry program should be done without legislation, because it is through legislation that you could put in the guarantees that it be nonpartisan and non-political, and not be a place where people will bore in from the outside. Ambassador Burns has done a lot of thinking about the new mission and mandate of the service, and he thinks that, and I agree with him, it would be much better if it was codified in legislation. If people could say, hey, the X Act, the 2021 Foreign Service Act or Diplomatic Service Act says this is our job. And I think it's more powerful that it's in this legislation, that it would be in legislation. We are recommending, you and I were talking a little bit before about professionalization. It ain't happening unless there are more people in the State Department who can go off to these assignments and get some education. Our military has what they call a 15% float for training and transit. We need the same. Well, that's expensive, and it isn't happening unless it's in legislation and then funded in the legislation. So I would say that there are just embedded in all of these recommendations are things that need the power of legislation. They need the power of law to be implemented. I'll give you one other example and then I'll stop, which is lessening politicization. Right? So I'd like to see the law say that there should be substantially less number of non-career appointees at our ambassadorships overseas. Right? So nobody on this call would say, hey, let's make the Navy captain who's in charge of an aircraft carrier or destroyer or an Aegis cruiser be a political appointee who contributed a bunch of money to a political campaign, Republican or Democrat. But somehow, embassy here, embassy there, this can be done by amateurs. I don't believe that. And so again, I'm not for zero political appointees. They bring very important skills into the department, and they ought to continue. And great Americans have been ambassadors, so don't get me wrong here. But the number now is too high. Ought to be lower. That ought to be in legislation.
Okay, so you also mentioned the importance of funding that would be necessary to follow through on some of these changes that you would be recommending if they were to be enacted in law. And I've heard you talk before about how the U.S. military has been very successful at advocating for the funding that it needs. Military service is more visible to most Americans, I think, than diplomacy, not just because they have uniforms, because there are far more people who have served at some point in the military. You're more likely to know someone who has. And so you talked about the importance of the State Department advocating strongly for its budget and for what it needs to do these things, and that you have not necessarily seen that happen to the degree that it might need to yet. And so I wanted to ask, what do you think it will take in order for that to happen? And once it does, do you think that will resonate with members of Congress and their constituents advocating for a bigger diplomatic budget, given that, again, diplomacy is just a little harder to see than military service?
Well, let me say, I certainly hope so, and there's some evidence that it will. So let me answer your question in two ways. One is just exactly what we were talking about before, that people who are serving as Americans diplomats need to get out and make their case around the country, right? So think about the huge number of American citizens that were repatriated by American diplomats, and particularly people in the consular service, at the beginning of COVID-19 from countries all around the world. Thousands and thousands of people came home thanks to the State Department. Well, there's a story that lasted a day or two. And I think that had the State Department been more strategic about keeping that story going, like I'm sure our friends in the military would have, they would have called you up and said, gosh, Jill, we'd love to have a Yeutter Institute Sorensen lecture by somebody who was just involved in bringing 10,000 people home from Bolivia, right? And you'd have said, sure, let's do that. And that would have helped get this out. So the first thing is the State Department, the Foreign Service, culture change, get more of this out there. Second thing is we should do exactly what our military colleagues do, which is assign people up on Capitol Hill so that they're there all the time. And there are a few, and they do a great job. But when you think about the numbers of military officers, and especially now senior people who got their start as liaisons on Capitol Hill, are fantastic, because they learn all of the ways and how it works. Think about your old boss, Senator Hagel, right? So he had a call on military people when he was a senator, and they were there for him, and they could answer his questions and do things for him. We ought to do the same thing. If you say, will this resonate? I believe it will. And the reason I do is if you look at the last 4 years, the administration has on several occasions sent to the Congress a State Department budget that was cut 20 and 25, 30%. And what happened was that in both the Senate and the House, members put the money back. And so the administration, I think, has run into the fact that there are people in the Congress who value diplomacy, who value the State Department, and are prepared to stand up for it. We just like to make it a little more systematic.
Okay, so a related audience question that came in on this one, submitted by a professor of military science who's involved in the ROTC program here, it relates to this budget question, and that is, the question is, how do you recommend that we as a nation address the disproportionate growth of the DoD budget, which, as we know, is many hundreds of billions of dollars more than the State Department budget, right, compared to the State Department budget, in an effort, though, to reduce the State Department's reliance on the DoD and other agencies for execution of their operations? How would you?
Yes, I think that's extremely important. And again, a reason to have a reserve corps, or a reason to have a mid-level entry program. But let me say, first of all, that's a great question, but I start with this fact, that as a diplomat, what do I want? I want the strongest possible US military that we can have, because diplomacy is a lot better off when it's backed by the threat of force or force. And so you won't find a senior diplomat who says, oh, well, it doesn't matter about the military. We want a strong military, a strong Air Force, a strong Navy, a strong Marine Corps, a strong Army, because that's what backs up diplomacy and helps us project our power. So I'm not for weakness where that's involved. I do think, though, that the disparity is huge. The idea somehow that it's all going to come in some balance, I think that's crazy, because you couldn't spend that amount of money on the State Department, nor should you. The idea is to try to find several billions of dollars, which of course tiny compared to the military budget, but huge if you're a citizen, and find several billions of dollars, 4 or 5, to see if you could strategically target that investment and to increase the State Department's capacity. The State Department doesn't need $100 billion to land in it. Couldn't spend it, wouldn't know what to do with it. And you'd be breaking the institution. So that's why we say, spend $400 or $500 million on this 15% float on training and transit. Spend $1 billion on a pilot project on the Diplomatic Reserve Corps. Increase the capacity of professionalization, which would cost what? $100 million? I don't know, but small amounts of money in compared to the DoD budget. So it's right to say the comparison is out there, but I don't think I would ever testify in front of the Congress that, oh, well, there has to be, balance has to be equal. Balance will never be equal. And that's unrealistic. The question is, can you take a reasonable amount of money that you can convince taxpayers will be well used to increase the capacity of the State Department? When you think about what General Mattis has said, fund the State Department or I have to buy more bullets. Or during the times when, in Iraq and Afghanistan, people had to transfer money over to the State Department. And it just doesn't work. It doesn't work over the long term. Those are short-term fixes. Final question, I think embedded there, as you said and as your listener said, is this issue of, can the State Department take back some of the jobs that have been given away or have been ceded because of lack of capacity? My answer is some, but not all. If you think about, for example, the effort that we made both in Iraq and Afghanistan to have the State Department take the lead on police training, it was worth a try. But would I make the State Department the lead police training entity of the United States of America? No, I think I'd leave that to some piece of the Pentagon. So yes, there are certain things that need to be taken back. But again, I think we have to be strategic and thoughtful about this and say, there's something that diplomats can do. There's something that people at the State Department can do. Conflict prevention, post-conflict efforts, all those kinds of things. But there are certain things we've learned since 2001 that I think have to stay with our military colleagues.
Thank you, Ambassador Grossman. We are getting close to the end of our time here, so I want to kind of wrap up with this question for students and for others listening who, again, might be considering a career in the Foreign Service. I know you've said you hope people will take the test and join it and stay in it for the long haul. And I know you and I have talked in the past before a lot about how important it is to be curious and to want to serve. What else would you tell someone who maybe is still in college and thinking about this, about what they can do to prepare themselves for such a career?
Yeah, I think that, well, again, I just want to repeat that I hope people who are interested will pursue that interest, because diplomacy is a wonderful career and a wonderful way to serve the United States. I think, Jill, as you and I have talked about, when I think about what it is that makes people successful in the service, and I'm sure it's the same thing that makes people successful at the University of Nebraska or in business, and I see it now in my own business. And what is it? It's this curiosity. You have to be interested in how other people live and how other people make their decisions, how other people set their priorities. And secondly, it's a lot of hard work. And I'm sure there are people who could do this without working hard and are just geniuses. Me, I wasn't one of them. But there's an enormous amount of effort involved, and you have to be prepared to put out that effort. Third, in terms of people who are looking at their academic careers or what they should study, one of the things that I've come to believe in looking at the Foreign Service is the broader the education, the better. Because on any given day, you could be working on an economic problem, on a political problem, on a human rights problem, on a consular problem, on a public diplomacy problem. So the more you know about the more things, and that's also, I think, really good. And the other thing that we are emphasizing in this report is we need people to be lifelong learners. We need people to come into the State Department. And what happens when you're in government service? You are giving capital away, intellectual capital, as you do your job. Well, as our military has learned, you need to kind of reinvigorate that intellectual capital from time to time. And our culture has been, oh, no. We're just going to serve, and training gets in the way of my career, professionalization. I don't want to take any time off. We need lifelong learners, people who believe that they can learn something new. And then we're going to need, I think, people who have some technical skills as well, who are interested in data science and AI and the sciences. And so the broader people's education is, the better. And then finally, as you said, there's got to be a belief in service, that this is what I want to do. And there are many ways to serve, and many ways to have a great life. I happen to fall into this one. I hope other people will, but it's a chance to serve your country.
Thank you, Ambassador Grossman. That's a great note to end on, and a very good message for our students and others listening as well. I want to thank you again and thank the Public Policy Center as well as the College of Arts and Sciences and Dean Button for their partnership on this wonderful discussion. We will be looking for the recommendations and report when it's released in November. And know this is the beginning of more conversation to be had about all of this. But again, Ambassador Grossman, thank you very much for joining us for this discussion today. We really appreciate it very much.
Thank you. And thank, again, everyone who organized this, and for all the people who stuck with us for the hour. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to all our listeners, and thank you, everyone.